A warm welcome to our event, Knowledge for a Complex World, Rethinking the Roles of Peace Research and Peace Education, organized by the Berkhof Foundation and the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy. We're looking forward to an interesting panel discussion with 4 speakers from Peace Education and Peace Research, and they'll be introduced shortly. If you have any questions to the panel, please post them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We will forward your questions to the moderators, and there will be time at the end to answer your questions. The event is planned for about 75 minutes. So now let us begin with some welcome words by the 2 directors of the respective institutions, Andrew Gilmore and then Ursula Schröder. Andrew, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Anna, and a very warm welcome to me too, and particularly to our co-hosts. I met Ursula 14 months ago in Hamburg, and we rapidly established that we both had our 50th anniversaries coming up this year. And we discussed doing a joint commemoration. Would it be in Hamburg or in Berlin or maybe in both? But alas, it's in neither of those great cities. We have to do it solely virtually, unfortunately. Anyway, but here are 2 well-known and I would say respected institutions, respected internationally as well as inside Germany, in the fields of peace and security research, peace operations, and peace education. Both were, of course, founded in 1971 at a rather acute phase of the Cold War in a very divided country, with the aim of contributing to change things for the better through rapprochement by offering research, policy advice, and education. I'm not going to list the really vast number of challenges that the world and Europe are currently facing, from the pandemic, climate change, migration, and many, many other issues, including military threats from the East. I won't list all those things too. I think it reinforces the mission of both organizations and reinforces also the need for us to collaborate. What we are hoping out of this meeting is that we can come up with new ideas for new forms of collaboration to see how peace research and peace education can come together to more systemically deal with these vast challenges. Thank you so much.
Dear Andrew, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's my real pleasure to introduce this joint event by Berkhof Foundation and IFSH on knowledge for a complex world, rethinking the role of peace research and peace education today. Because as we've heard, we are both institutions that have now become 50 years old, and we know that peace research and peace education share a common history. We are from fields that have developed in parallel, that have long shared a common agenda. As the godfather, if you like, of peace research, Johann Galtung once argued, peace research is an intellectual enterprise devoted to the study of peace and the bringing about of a state of peace in human society. And linked to this, peace education is an attempt to pass on the benefits of peace research to a wider audience. A lot of things have changed since then. And nevertheless, our 2 institutions, the Berkhof Foundation and IFSH, exemplify this close connection. We have both long been active in peace research and peace education, and we also share a long history of cooperation in peace education at the university level as part of our master's program, Peace and Security Studies in Hamburg, in which the Berkhof Foundation is a long-term and indispensable partner. And our students always come back from Berlin and profit from the excellent supervision and the support they receive in Berlin, and we really like this cooperation. So given our shared histories, it was an obvious choice really to organize a joint event today to celebrate our anniversaries together. And I'm very happy that we're here today, if only virtually. And we can also take this opportunity to reflect on the state of peace research and peace education today, and in particular on the question of their relationship. Because we've seen that both fields have less of a coherent agenda today, and both fields need to address a set of really crucial challenges. And let me point you to 2 of these challenges, and let's see whether we can discuss some of this later in the panel. Because first of all, I believe that our paradigm of peace needs to change in the field of increasingly planetary challenges to peace and survival. We know that our fields developed in response to the horrors of World War I and World War II, but we now need to adapt our thinking and our acting to the possibility that our survival on this planet is at stake today. It is actually no longer enough to focus on eliminating war. What we need to think about today is more radical. We need to position both peace research and peace education in a new paradigm of positive and sustainable peace that takes the global and planetary challenges of the climate crisis, of the global pandemic, and of other emerging and potentially lethal global challenges seriously. So a focus on negative peace and on the elimination of war remains a necessary, but no longer a sufficient condition for peace. And secondly, the emergence of these entangled and global insecurities shows us that peace education and peace research need to evaluate their ways of producing and disseminating knowledge and expertise. Because for peace research, phenomena such as climate change or the pandemic do not only lead us to expand our range of topics. These phenomena increasingly call for the combination of different bodies of knowledge in our research. And at the same time, the knowledge we produce has become contested. In times of fake news, in times of polarization, and with citizens increasingly mistrustful of science and research, our fields now need to take stock of how we produce and how we disseminate knowledge and for whom. Whom do we represent? Whose values do we seek to transport? And who's our audience? And how do we fully take into account a diversity of voices and perspectives? And what I've seen is that in the past years and also decades, I believe, peace research and peace education have, at least in the German context, drifted apart, rather than trying to tackle these challenges together. And oftentimes, the once clear transmission belt between our two fields no longer works, with discussions between people more active in basic research and those more dedicated to peace education, rather few and sometimes far in between. And I believe that it is time to bring these fields back together. In times of crisis like today, we need to harness the combined knowledges of our fields, and the study of peace and the education about peace remains imperative in a world where we have to find out anew how we can live together peacefully and sustainably on this planet. So I very much look forward to our discussion, to this input and the discussion of our excellent panel, and also to future cooperations between our two institutions. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so thanks so very, very much, Andrew, and thank you, Ursula, for these very important and interesting introductions. My name is Uli Jäger. I'm head of the Department Global Learning for Conflict Transformation of the Berger Foundation, and together with my colleague Holger, I will try to moderate this session. Let me start. I remember many discussions in the past about the relations between peace research and peace education, and it was often about how peace education can contribute to the dissemination of the results of peace research. Today we know that it should not be a one-way road. Both peace research and peace education are like communicating tubes. Today, in our discussions, it's about the further improvement of this kind of communicating, and I'm very happy about your words, Ursula, that we should work more together in the future, because this kind of communicating and cooperative relationship is more important than ever. The challenges, we have heard this, are very, very great. It's about contemporary, peace-oriented forms of learning and teaching, about reducing complexity or addressing different target groups. Saying this, I'm more than happy that we have 4 colleagues with us who can give a lot of inspirations and answers to our questions. And it's a great pleasure for me now to introduce 2 wonderful colleagues from the peace education dimension. First of all, Tony Jenkins. He is Managing Director of the International Institute on Peace Education and coordinator of the global campaign for Peace Education. Lecturer in a lot of universities, very experienced in practice and in designing peace building and peace education programs and projects. To be honest, for me, Tony is like the face of the international peace education. So it's very great and be happy to have him with us, and happy about his initiative to develop a mapping of peace education. And we are happy to be a partner of this really important project. So welcome, Tony. Norbert Frieders Rührmann, professor for education science at the Catholic University in Aachen. He published a lot of articles and some very, very inspiring books about peace education in theory and in practice. Very, very important for the discussion in Germany and not only here. He has a lot of experiences in practice work in the context of development cooperation, evaluation, monitoring, and most important, from my perspective, he is partner of our Peace Education and Global Learning Department of the Berghoff Foundation since a lot of years. And we have tried to manage a lot of projects together. So great to have you with us. Very, very welcome.
Thanks, Uli. And also a very warm welcome from my side, everyone. Let me introduce you to our two other speakers. First of all, I'd like to welcome Elvira Rosat, who is a professor for international relations at University of Hamburg and IFSH, and has a long-standing interest in the role of science for society and politics. And Elvira has become a leading voice from the social sciences in the last 2 years in debates how to respond better to the pandemic. And with that experience, I'm quite sure she has quite interesting things to say in our discussion today. I'd also like to very warmly welcome Berit Bliesemann de Guevara, who is a professor of international politics at Aberystwyth University. Berit is known for her work on the role of knowledge and expertise and the politics of knowledge and expertise, actually. But she has also found quite innovative ways of identifying sources and materializations of knowledge. So if you ever wondered why peace research should deal with textile making and stitching, she's the one person probably in the world you want to talk to. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. So good to have you, Berit. All right, with that introduction, I'd like to start our discussion. And again, as Ursula Schröder just said in the beginning, one of the things we are keen to find out is in a world that becomes increasingly complex and where knowledge becomes increasingly contested, what is the role of peace research and peace education? And how can it fulfill the expectations politics and societies might have on them? And my first question, therefore, would go to Elvira. So, Elvira, what do you think? What has the field in this regard accomplished in the past, or what hasn't accomplished by the field?
Thanks, Holger, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here on this fascinating panel. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and I'm honored to make the first substantive statement. So thanks for that. And I would like by defining first what complexity is, because I think this is also crucial to understand what complexity is to be able to show what the role of science is with regard to complexity. So first, a very basic definition of complexity is to understand it as a pattern of interconnected elements that are part of the same system or even of different interconnected systems. And this is important to acknowledge because this means that changes of certain elements and in certain elements within those systems will have an impact on other systems and on other elements. And this is what makes problem solution so challenging in crisis and with regard to many policy fields. So the elements are not isolated, and it's not possible to address just some of them without also creating some kind of effects on other elements. So what role does science play? with regard to addressing complexity. I think here we can distinguish three basic functions. The first is to provide a specific perspective. The other is to provide the analytic tools. And the third function would be to provide evidence, but also theory-based solutions for problems for which we don't have yet the evidence available. Regarding the specific perspective, this means that we have to acknowledge the complexity of problem structures and to adopt a complexity-oriented perspective, which will help us to understand what those crucial elements of a problem structure are, and what the patterns of change are that we can expect, and what are the mechanisms that are transmitting this change from some elements to others. So this is what I would understand as complex thinking. And this is, of course, needed if you want to address complex problems such as climate change or the pandemic. So science in the first place helps us uncovering and understanding complexity. And then in a second step, this knowledge may be applied to accompany or even help designing processes of change, meaning developing problem solutions. So now to peace research, more specifically. I think what is crucial here is the kind of trivial focus on conflicts that we as peace researchers have, on conflicts of very different kind. And through our various analytical tools, we are able to point out the complexity of such conflict situations. And ideally, we can help to develop comprehensive solutions that take into account different parts of the system. And as an example, and then I'll come to the end with my statement, I would like to use the challenge of urban mobility reforms. So as has been noted quite frequently, and as everyone also experienced herself and himself, space in cities is highly unevenly distributed between cars on the one hand, consuming a lot of driving and parking space, while bikes, scooters, and pedestrians are allowed comparably little space. So there's a lot of discussions going on with regard to car-free cities. And if you look at what people wish for and how they would like to live, and how they imagine a beautiful urban living, the images you see usually don't show cars or involve cars, but rather spaces to walk, to cycle, to sit, and to meet people from the neighborhood. But even so, this is a pretty much consensual image. Its implementation that is actually creating such spaces and car-free areas within cities is very rare and usually highly conflictual. So a complexity perspective combined with a peace research background can help us to analyze the situation as a distributive conflict and to understand the different interests and positions involved in this conflict, and then try to develop solutions that allow for the necessary change while at the same time mitigating the conflicts and reducing unintended effects of such reforms. For example, crowding out the traffic from one neighborhood into the other. And regarding to what the field has already accomplished, I would say that peace research is very strong in terms of theories, in terms of conceptual tools, and also in terms of empirical knowledge. But I would still think that there is a deficit of translating these, the richness of the field into our involvement into ongoing societal and global conflicts.
Thanks so much. I was actually hoping for such a very clearly structured answer from you. So that was one of the reasons why I thought we should start with you. But before we respond to your views, let me ask Berit basically the same question. Berit, what do you think, what is today's role of peace research and what should it be when it comes to questions of relevance for politics and society?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and to start with, also many congratulations to IFSH and Berghoff Foundation on their anniversaries. Well, I think I'm perhaps a little less confident in our capacity to steer processes. And I think for me, the core task of future peace research is to really conduct that critical research that takes into account those global kind of complex interrelations that both Elvira and Ursula talked about, while at the same time doing so in much more kind of co-creative ways
that are actually meaningful to people and lead to transformative practice. And before I unpack these two dimensions, let me also just say that I don't think my own research actually lives up to this. So rather, these are ideas I'm currently kind of trying to think through and make sense of. I'd like to put them out here for discussion. The first dimension of this is kind of critical research. And by this, I do mean kind of research in the tradition of critical theory, which takes this kind of important step back to look at the wider picture. But I think this necessarily, as previous speakers have said, needs to include a wider set of questions of global power effects around colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, this Enlightenment idea of mankind's domination of nature, and so on. So as was said before, those planetary crises we are facing are clearly interlinked. So we cannot think about peace building without thinking about colonial power, capitalism, racism, climate change. We cannot think about climate change without thinking about extractivism, consumerism, North-South relations, or the blessing or curse of technical solutions, and so on. And I think this needs to be more reflected in the questions we ask. Still too much, I think, of what we do as peace and conflict scholars is to concentrate on trying to make those existing solutions work better, rather than trying to more radically rethink what peace and security or safety in such a complex context could actually also look like, and what other ideas and practices they might be linked to. So for example, in the case of peasant communities in Colombia, we've been working with, peace and security or safety are thought about in much more in a much more contextualized way of practices of collectivity, of mutual care, of food sovereignty, defending rural territories from pollution and extractivism, but also kind of in terms of dignity and a dignified life. The good news, I think, is that those ways of thinking peace and security differently already exist. They exist in the practices of some communities and organizations, and thinking about co-creation of research can really help us bring such ideas more into our own focus. Just to give you another example, there are currently over 80 organizations worldwide and many more communities in conflict zones who have developed kind of effective strategies for the protection of civilians, which are based on civilian agency and non-violence. Nonetheless, if we look into our libraries, by far the majority of research on peacekeeping and the protection of civilians in armed conflict is still concentrated on armed peacekeepers. And I think we would be well advised to give ideas and practices such as these some more attention. And that brings me then to the second point, or dimension, the translation into transformative practice. I think that's for most of us a more complicated step, and it's often or too often still missing, especially from critical research, because yeah, somehow there seems to be this kind of boundary of trying to actually think about what to do. But it really matters if critical research is to make a difference to people. And I think there are kind of some practical steps we could take in this regard. One is certainly to understand our research not so much as educating others, but as mutual learning with people, with communities, with partners. And this certainly also calls for a more kind of horizontal research relationship between academic and kind of practical or experiential knowledges, which I think should go much deeper than just bringing some participatory elements into our research. And a part of this could be, for example, as Holger has mentioned, to expand our research toolbox to include those methodologies. It doesn't have to be needlework, but it can be a kind of account for these other forms of knowledge. So not just the propositional knowledge that we create as academics, but also all these experiential, embodied and kind of practical knowledges out there. But I think for that to happen at a broader basis, we also need to keep working on undoing the very power structures within the field of creating knowledge. So within the field of peace research, for example, which keeps us from taking certain steps. And I think there's specifically kind of leverage for us and those kind of in more senior positions among us to do something in our roles as teachers, peer reviewers, funding council advisors, or members of committees to make those changes that allow us those more equitable research relationships and those kind of roads less traveled, perhaps. I think my 5 minutes are probably up, so I'll stop here and hand back to you, Holger.
Well, thanks so much. Part of my fascination for your work on textile making might be my own experience from high school with it. Well, we'll see. Anyway, I think there's a lot that aligns very well with our two other speakers. Uli, back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. A lot of very important keywords, and but Holger and me, we have the task to have sometimes a look at the time schedule. So let's try to keep short. Yes, of course. Let's come back to our basic question to Tony and Norbert. From your perspective, what is the role of peace education in politics and society today? Many people, not only young people, are looking for orientation, and we have to give answers. So, what is your perspective on this very, very important question, Tony?
Thank you, Uli. I'm really excited that we're having this conversation today. As many of you might know, here in the United States, today is Thanksgiving. It's a holiday, which of course, from a perspective of a peace educator, it's one that we try to really critically investigate the origins of this holiday. But nonetheless, I think we've developed some really wonderful traditions, at least within our families, of giving thanks. And so today I'm actually very thankful for having this opportunity to be in this conversation, to challenge and look at the role of knowledge in a complex world. So this question is a really good one, and please pardon me in advance if my response is a bit theoretical. I'll try to get to the practical too. I just finished recently writing an article on this particular topic. It's particularly looking at the role of education contributing to personal, structural, and cultural change. So some of this is really kind of fresh in the back of my mind from a theoretical lens. So from my perspective, which certainly is, you really said I was the face of peace education. It's not the perspective of all peace education, just my personal perspective, and which is very much rooted in sort of a blended tradition of Paulo Freire and the work of my friend and mentor, Dr. Betty Reardon. I think of peace education as obviously more than just education about peace, but education for peace. So in a way, it's investigating the role of education contributing to personal, relational, structural, and cultural change. And it's sort of addressing this point about transformative practice that was brought up by Barrett a minute ago. So to me, I think what peace education in the context of the world that we're living in now, it should support learners in developing a critical consciousness of both the world as it is and then the world as it should be. And then to add to this, obviously peace education needs to work on cultivating the knowledge, skills, and capacities that are required to support learners in facilitating that transition from one to the other. And I think this is a view that's particularly relevant to transforming our, well, as of yet not post-COVID world, as obviously the coronavirus has made abundantly clear and visible the many sort of pre-existing violences and injustices that were pretty much previously rendered invisible by various cultural assumptions and social, political, and economic structures that shape our world. Our colleagues who with the Latin American Council for Peace Research have been leveraging this increased consciousness into an educational campaign that they're pursuing through the Manifesto for a New Normality. And the purpose of this campaign is to really critically reflect upon, the pre-pandemic reality, while also stimulating citizen commitment to participative construction of a new and just and necessary normality through awareness and collective reflection. So what they're really calling forth is a political process that's facilitated through education. I'm going to guess that many of you know our good friend Werner Wintersteiner from Austria. Years ago, he contested that there is no concept that explains sufficiently how education fits into the process of political change. We have to be aware of this theoretical gap of peace research rather than to blame peace education for it. I really agree with Werner that we have much work to do to close these theoretical gaps. From my perspective, again, peace education is overtly and intentionally political. It most often starts with inquiry into violence in its myriad and in complex relational forms, both direct and indirect, and including especially various forms of epistemic violence. And these are really kind of the focal points from which peace education helps to help learners kind of develop a diagnosis and prognosis of their world. However, I think that these very cognitive, these very analytic dimensions only comprise one part of learning. As peace education is obviously also very futures oriented, we need to understand its role and potential to foster human agency, which is necessary for social and political transformation. So developing human agency, preparing learners for participating in political processes requires a holistic, comprehensive pedagogical approach. Simply having cognition or awareness or knowledge about a complex social problem, even if it's accompanied by a vision of a preferred social alternative, we find is generally insufficient if the internal conviction to take external action is not also generated. So basically in response to Werner, what I'd put forward is that the answer to how we pedagogically generate human agency might be one of the missing pieces to the puzzle of how education can contribute to political and structural change. So political agency is particularly goal directed and assumes that an individual is acting with intention toward applying their individual power to affect change on the structures of society. Of course, human agency can be hampered by the presence of conditions of enduring structural violence and oppression, but nonetheless, cultivating the human agency that's necessary for intentionally pursuing personal, structural, and cultural transformation can be approached through things like elicitive and reflective learning, modes of learning that foster recognition of the intimately intertwined relationships between present structural conditions, social and political histories, individual psychological dispositions, and even the epistemic conditioning that shapes the orientations that we have to the world. And I think this potential for human agency is further enhanced when this generally inward reflective learning process becomes a social process, a dialogic process of communal meaning making and potential political action. And I think that's essentially what we're doing here today. So thanks for letting me set that up.
Thanks so much, Tony. Very interesting. So a lot of new aspects, but also a lot of connection points to what our colleagues from research has said. So really great. To prepare learners for the transformation, this is one of the most important keywords. Maybe Norbert, the same question to you, of course, the role of peace education today in these very, very difficult times.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation and the warm welcome in this session. Yeah, a complex question requires a complex answer, actually. But as there are only 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, yeah. I'd like to start with my observation that I have the impression that the expectations in regard of peace education and politics and society often are driven by an overload. There is an overload, the role is overloaded, and the expectations are often too high. We can see it in many conflict countries. For example, I just come back from Ethiopia, and you know that this is a very serious genocide going on now, and now everybody's calling for peace education. That's somehow a little bit strange and a little bit late, so to say. So this is one thing, it's my impression that there's often this overload and the expectations are too high. And Senghas, one of our most valued colleagues, said, how is even peace education possible in a world which is known as a world which is dominated by an organized peacelessness or by organized structural violence? How can we really think about peace education in these areas? But on the other side, I think often the potential of peace education is underestimated, and often, and that is my personal perspective, often we can do much more than just looking into schools and just looking into the formal education sector. And I think the challenge and the potential also is in the regard of much broader understanding of peace education. And I'm really convinced when we, for example, look at the lateral pyramid of levels, that peace education is important far beyond the level 1, the micro level. Peace education is much more than school education. It's much more than education of youth and children. And it is really there's really a potential, and I observe this role already in many movements in many areas in the world, where it really can be used to open the perspective for collective competence in conflict-affected environments, community-related approaches, where I can see that is a high potential. Maybe often the people do not call it peace education, but when I look as a peace education researcher on this praxis, I'm convinced it is a kind of collective peace work, collective peace education. A lot of skills are gained, a lot of competences are developed, which from my side are deeply rooted in peace education. And to focus more on this collective and community-related approaches, I think this is also a challenge, but also already there, that we can really say peace education is much more than school education and much more than reaction when everything fails, like now in Ethiopia, facing a genocide. Everybody is asking for peace education, which is too late now, so to say. But as Salomon said, the famous peace educator from Israel, peace education can take place in each context and in each status of violence. And I'm convinced that that is our chance as peace educators.
Thanks so much, Norbert, for this broader perspective, and it's never too late. So, yeah, Holger.
Yeah, thanks. Also, thank you very much for these really interesting insights from a part of the field that I'm not as familiar with as you are. I was thinking about what Norbert just said, where he started his conversation by saying that there's often an overload of expectations, maybe. And I was, of course, thinking, Vera, on what you are currently doing publicly, but also, I guess, in other circumstances, and that is advising politics and society how to deal with the pandemic. And have you seen such thing? Would you say there's an overload of expectations on the role of science?
There's certainly a lot of contestation what science can and should do in such a pandemic. So when we discuss what the potential contribution of science is, I think there are three different things that we might see. And the first one, and I would like to mention it, even though it might sound trivial for peace researchers and also peace educators, but it's not to other disciplines. As peace researchers, we are kind of much more used taking sides than, say, psychologists or virologists. And right now there is an ongoing debate, not just in Germany, I believe, regarding the role of science with regards to this global crisis. So how political can science become at a certain point? Are we as scientists allowed to formulate normative assessments and policy recommendations based on certain values? Are scientists the right ones? So it means, are they in a position to criticize the governments and to question their decisions and their policy solutions? How much advocacy can science take? And for me, I always felt that this question was not particularly pertinent, since I had already resolved it earlier by becoming a peace researcher with a clear mission and a clear commitment and a clear normative motivation, namely to contribute to peace on different levels. So I think the first contribution of peace research in this particular crisis that I consider necessary and also kind of intuitive is to take a clear stance here and to stress the need to ensure human security and to save human lives, while at the same time preserving intra-societal peace and also global justice. And coming back to complexity that we talked about earlier, I think it becomes immediately clear how challenging this is in such a crisis. The second potential contribution, I think it's quite classic. It involves investigating the effects of the pandemic in a classic way. So, for example, to direct the public and also political attention to potentially overlooked problems like the increase of domestic violence, or the increase of food insecurity and the risk of social unrest in affected areas. And the third and last potential contribution that I would like to mention involves developing solutions and making suggestions how to find a better way of dealing with this crisis. And here, of course, as social scientists, we are well equipped with theories about human behavior, about political decision-making, about the internal workings of institutions, to develop solutions. At the same time, pandemic as a complex social and systemic crisis cannot be addressed by virologists or physicists or even doctors alone. So it cannot be addressed without them either. But my impression is that from the beginning, social science has been heavily neglected in the whole management of this pandemic. So just to look maybe at one particular strategy of containment. And here we can easily see that many disciplines need to be involved to develop long-lasting and socially acceptable solutions. Of course, we need economists, for example, to calculate what kind of economic compensation closed businesses need. We need psychologists who develop communication strategies and who can inform decision makers about compliance and adherence and so on, or motivation to vaccinate. That is the current topic in Germany. We need education scientists to help understanding the effects of massive school closures that we had during the last 2 years. And we need peace researchers. And I think this is where our main task is right now, to highlight the conflicts that the management of this pandemic has induced in societies. And here we need to come up with creative ways of addressing those conflicts that run through very many different families, through many very different levels, starting with families, but also involving colleagues and very, very many contexts. And I think the big task for peace research will be to show the need for reconciliation after this pandemic, and also to see what we can contribute from other contexts where reconciliation processes already took place to the current situation here.
If I can add on this, well, thanks first of all for answering this question so thoroughly. I wonder what you think about what Berit just said in the beginning of her statement about her feeling that she might have a lack of confidence or about the fragility of our knowledge. Because when I read your public statements about what the best way would be to deal with the pandemic, it all sounds always pretty clear to me, and pretty easy actually for such a complex thing as you just described it. But I still wonder, don't you often feel that your knowledge or the knowledge in the pandemic might be as fragile as Berit just said? And should that cause a more cautious approach in developing strategies?
Yes, absolutely. So frequently I thought that I'm probably a much better epidemiologist than social scientist, because so many things happened that I could not imagine they would happen 2 years ago. So if someone had told me that 20 months later we would face the situation because of the social and political reactions to this, I wouldn't have predicted this and I wouldn't have foreseen this. So yes, there's a lot of things that became clear or are becoming clear to me that I think need to be reflected also in conceptual terms. And the misfit between scientific advice and political decision-making is just once. Even so, I think at the analytical level, we can explain what happened. It's still difficult to process as a human being, and also as someone who has a certain normative stance that this happened. So I'm not even sure this shows the limits or the fragility of our knowledge, because I think the knowledge would be sufficient to explain many, many things, yes, but maybe there are certain elements that we overlooked, that we haven't taken into consideration. And I think one element is that everyone is, for the first time in history, affected personally. And I think this is something that we lack with regard to decision making frequently. So I think decision makers much more act here as persons and personally affected, like everyone else. Same applies to media, same of course applies to researchers. And I think this would be one of the factors. And the second one probably is the limits of competence to process complex situations, which I wouldn't have assumed to be that strong in some parts, at least, of the political system.
All right, thanks. I'm inclined to ask Berit what she thinks about post-conflict societies and how people feel affected, but I should go back to Uli first. Uli.
Okay, thank you, Holger. So Elvira mentioned the need for reconciliation, and this is a very important keyword from my perspective. So Tony, as a result, or as a first result of your mapping project, I guess you have a lot of insights into the practice of peace education in these days. So maybe two short questions. The first one, what from your perspective are currently, let's say, the most important needs of peace education practitioners and multipliers? And maybe in addition to this and to your concrete work, what can be the contribution of networks, such like as a global campaign for peace education, to this or in this regard?
Thanks, Uli. Actually, right now in the back of my mind is this thought to want to respond to this frame that Norbert put out there of the overload of expectations, because I think it's relevant to this question in particular. And I think about this going back to kind of the earliest days of my kind of formal practice in peace education work, like post 9/11, we were getting phone calls in our office in New York City, asking, what can peace education do to fix this problem? And as Norbert said, it's already too late. The ship has left the dock, right, so to speak. So there's a certain expectation that's put on us to be able to address these problems. And our work isn't to just simply address the symptoms and the issues after the fact, but it's really kind of setting the foundations for prevention in a way. So I think that's something we have to keep in the back of our minds. But I think even the context of this kind of pandemic world that we're living in right now, just reflecting on my own experiences in the classroom, my spaces of learning have become one in which students are bringing in these collective and compounding traumas into a space of learning. And so there's a lot, I feel so burdened over the last 6 months in particularly as we've returned to in-person teaching. And it's this space, this expectation that we're dealing with those there is really can be overwhelming. So one thing I think obviously a need of the day for us in peace education is kind of providing spaces for support and care for us as educators, as we all need in this peace building work. But I think that there's two things that really stand out to me in the most general terms of things that are the most important needs for peace education practitioners in the moment. One is pedagogical preparation, and the second is political preparation, and they're both very intimately interrelated. I think on the pedagogical point, we need to really be aware as educators that the dispositions that we take in our classrooms is political. All right, so it's in that space we're modeling of a political relationship that gets extended outside the classroom. So obviously we need to be ever mindful of how our teaching practice informs and shapes the kind of political externalities, right, that emerge. So for example, we have to adjust the cognitive imperialism of colonialist pedagogies, right, and understand how they're an impediment to critical and reflective thinking, to social imagination, and the possibilities of peace and justice. So the emphasis on knowledge production and reproduction, coming from Eurocentric Western pedagogies, the traditions that have shaped most of us who are here today, and have been adopted by most systems of formal education. We have to have these in mind. And we have to be aware of how these pedagogies inherently impose a very kind of finite set of very deterministic social and political values that in some ways serve to maintain the world as it is. So these pedagogies mold certain epistemic assumptions of both teachers and students to conform to various narrow views of acceptable forms of knowledge and thought. And so this I would describe as a form of epistemological violence, right? And it produces cognitive biases. It's an obstacle to the development of the learner's full human potential, their well-being, their flourishing, and so forth and so on. So I think obviously this is an overly simplistic analysis here, but it's a starting point for us as educators to begin to develop an intentional reflective praxis. So some things we should reflect upon would be things like how do our general attitudes towards learning and or teaching shape how we show up in the classroom? Are we modeling reflection and learning, or are we reproducing hierarchies of knowledge? Are we eliciting learning from students, or are we feeding our egos by seeking to impart our knowledge upon them? And really briefly on my second point on political preparation, I'll be brief. I think this goes to the overload of expectations issue here. There's a tremendous responsibility and burden that's placed upon educators as agents of nurturing learning towards social, structural, and political change. And I think it's important for us from kind of a strategic point of view as formal peace educators, so at least those working in schools or on educational policy, to understand that traditionally political top-down strategic efforts to institutionalize peace education in schools rarely succeed, particularly as the critical approaches to peace education that we generally take challenge the very structures and the ways of thinking that schools have been designed to uphold. And we understand, of course, that schools are but an extension of a given society. However, I think there may be another way. As we kind of work with teachers and thinking about the role in these formal contexts, we might approach the task of transforming formal education as critical pedagogues and not as politicians, right? So institutions learn in very similar ways that humans learn. They're more likely to transform when the learning is elicited, it's cultivated and nurtured from within, rather than imposed by some authority from above. So generating this kind of transformative institutional agency is a process of learning as much as it is a process of politics. And the last point about the roles of the various networks. So I represent a couple different networks. One is the International Institute on Peace Education, which is an intensive residential learning community that meets every other summer in a different country. We used that institute in particular in our work as a space to exchange knowledge, to experiment pedagogically, to learn with and from one another, and really kind of try to advance peace education in theory and practice. We do have an institute coming up in Mexico next summer, exploring a theme of intercultural peace learning. The other hat I wear is the Global Campaign for Peace Education Coordinator. And this is sort of a global social movement on building public awareness and political support for the introduction of peace education. As you pointed out, we've been coordinating a global research effort called Mapping Peace Education, of which Berghoff is an important partner for us. And this project is kind of an open access online resource intended for researchers, donors, practitioners, policymakers, and others, providing evidence-based data and analysis of formal and non-formal peace education efforts in countries around the world. So for us, this is really an effort to demonstrate the effectiveness of peace education and document it so others can learn from those experiences.
Great, thanks so much, Tony. So we have two very, very short questions for Berit and Norbert. And please, with very, very, very extremely short answers, because we should have a look at the chat, because there are questions too. So Holger.
Yeah, I think, well, questions are piling up and time is running out and there's so much to say, but Berit, very briefly, one thing that responds to something Tony just said again is the question how to scale up processes of co-creative and mutual learning in small local communities to initiate actual political and societal change. That is something where I would be interested in your thoughts. But if I may add, from the chat, there were questions, and maybe you have an answer on that, also about the role of such processes as creating space of dismantling fear, and the role of psychology in such processes. And if you have a word on that, that would be great as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Very difficult question to answer in very short time. Just one word on your previous question of what happened in post-conflict societies during this pandemic. So no matter whether you talk to partners in Colombia or Myanmar or South Sudan, pandemics and the way whole countries were locked down. It was fantastic times for authoritarian politicians. So if everybody has to stay at home and nobody can defend human rights and so on, you can actually police it. That's great times for authoritarian politics. So I think for countries there, the pandemic is just one. I mean, for societies, it's just one problem out of many others, and not the most pressing one. Not like for us. On the question of how to scale up, yeah, that's a question that both kind of we and our kind of projects in Colombia, for example, around embroidery and so on, have asked ourselves how to scale up, also how to come out of this kind of preaching to the choir situation, right? So you put on events and then the same people show up who are already convinced of what you're doing. So that's a real problem. I think that's something to talk about more, and to find kind of more creative ways of engaging specifically those communities that do not engage with the type of process you're trying, the type of dialogue you're trying to have. So to rather think about the people we want to engage with as those who are perhaps most unlikely to usually come to whatever event we are putting on. So in our case, these were kind of exhibitions we put on of the embroideries we made in our projects, or which our participants made around their preferred stories on the transformation from being kind of a guerrilla fighter to being a civilian member of society. And the idea around this was to kind of have these, what we call the resonances. So visitors would be invited to think about what they stitch or unstitch or restitch when visiting these exhibitions and kind of seeing these narratives. Now, the problem is, of course, you try to put it on in kind of spaces where these things would be encountered by a wide variety of people, but these spaces are already part of power structures. So if you try to go to a museum or to an art gallery and they tell you, oh no, they can't possibly put an exhibition like this one on, then that's a problem, because you end up in those social spaces that are already kind of on your side. So I think scaling up is a major question. It's also a question among those organizations who do this nonviolent kind of accompaniment. There was just like the very first international virtual gathering of organizations who do this kind of work, specifically to create this kind of more conscious community of practice, so that not everybody does their own little thing, but they come together and actually find more donors to finance more of that work, which is quite often a problem to have the money for it and so on. So kind of making these things more visible, but it is problematic. And I think specifically this kind of, as Tony says, these processes that have to come from within are very difficult to scale up. I forgot the other question around psychiatry, or psychology, but maybe it's not a bad thing because I've probably talked too long already.
Yeah, we'll come back to that question. We still have a couple of questions to be answered, but first, Norbert, or back to you, Uli, I guess.
Yeah, thanks so much. Remembering our discussions about curricular development and all these things, to be very concrete, what are the three, no, let's say, what are the two most important topics that should be part of a let's say, peace research education curricula? What do you think? You are muted. but we can't hear you.
So,
Okay.
sorry, I tried to make it very short. There is no need for further topics. There is a need for understanding that we need new competences. And you know my discussion about that and my perception on that. I think there are many competences which are not fulfilled right now in regard of empathy, active listening, communicative skills, reflexive skills. And this is missing really in a lot of curriculum developments in regard of education, not only in peace education, but I think this is a weakness of the formal education system. And here we can benefit a lot from social work, which is actually my profession. And when Elvira mentioned that there's a need for psychologists and educators, I would say there is a need for social workers who often have a broader understanding of education and a broader understanding of skills and competence development, which is much more than cognitive and analytical. So that's my short answer for.
Thanks so much, Norbert. Great.
All right. Well, there are still a couple of questions from the chat, and we should delve into them. One would be, and maybe Norbert, if I may, or Tony, whether you have any thoughts on this. So there is a question about how important this is to have justice in societies, or just societies, as a condition for being able to promote such processes. Do you have any thoughts on the importance of justice? Tony, you want to say something? Or yeah, Norbert, I think
I was hoping for Norbert to take that one on. That's, it's just a big question. Can I think about that a minute? Let Norbert take a first crack at it.
Yeah,
sure. Norbert.
That is again a very big and complex question, and I would like to try to link to my answer before. For sure, the aspect of justice is one key factor in the whole discourse about peace education and a broader understanding. But the first thing is to understand the structures of injustice and to have to make people aware and make them sensitive what injustice includes and what layers and what dimensions injustice can have. Yeah, and I think that touches also the aspect of value education, reflexive competences. And not just putting a construct of injustice and being too normative, being more reflexive, and getting all the biographic experiences from the pupils or the peoples into the discussion. Yeah, where did they experience, for example, injustice in their life and things like that. So yes, it is a big issue, but it's not so easy just to say it is a big issue and we have to teach about it. It's more about how to discuss and to deal with it. It is there, and I think a lot of people we are working with have their own experiences with injustice, and that could be a starting point. This biographic approach.
Yeah, Tony, you want to add briefly on this, or Berit?
I think that's an excellent response.
Mm-hmm. Berit, yes, good.
No, I'm happy. I'm just reading the questions I missed before, but I think you will hand over to me.
Yeah, some of them are specifically directed to you, and I thought you might answer them directly because they were quite specific on the methodologies of participatory and co-creative learning. So I was hoping you would do that.
Yeah, shall I do so now or not?
Yes, feel free. If you just maybe you just answer them directly in the chat if that is possible. Yeah. Great. All right, so there's a good question, I think, also in the chat, why we are all white. And this is, of course, something that has been mentioned briefly in the discussion, but I think it's a crucial issue, and that is how we can contextualize our predominantly Western or global Northern understandings of education, knowledge, and learning. And I would like to hear some thoughts on the role of provincializing and relativizing our knowledge systems. Berit said something before, but maybe Norbert, Tony, do you want to say something on that? Or?
Yeah, certainly. I could say something really briefly about that. Obviously, it's the problem that we recognize in our field. I mean, there's certain things that we can certainly do to help address it. On one hand, it's, just obviously centering Indigenous non-Western perspectives in our curricula and giving intentional space to those voices, equitable space to those voices, I think is really important. But also, I think the key thing here from a pedagogical perspective is the need to be able to center the experiences of the learner in the context of that learning so it becomes relevant to them. There's a question of relevance, I think, was brought up at a number of different points throughout the conversation today as well. And I think the challenge of peace education isn't just an issue of messaging. I think there's another question here looking at this question, that we're not, conveying our knowledge in a helpful way. But it's a question of how you present that knowledge in a way that connects to the experience of the student, of the learner, of people in society. And that's a pedagogical challenge.
Thanks. Elvira, may I approach you directly with two questions that came up in the chat that I think you might have a view on. First, and I just mentioned them together, and you decide how you answer them. Well, there's first a question whether our knowledge wasn't, well, the promotion of our knowledge was just not successful enough before the crisis. So maybe we didn't do enough to demonstrate our relevance before the crisis. And I was wondering about your opinion. And the other one, and I think everyone who knows you knows why I'm asking you that question, is the role of social media in such processes. And I'm quite sure you have something to say on that as well.
Yes, great questions. I'm not sure I can answer them actually. So I can't say whether this was a supply or a demand problem that there were so few social scientists involved. I think even the perception from social science initially was that we don't have to contribute much on this, at least in the first months. Even people working on global health seemed kind of overwhelmed by this kind of event. Still, there is also a demand problem, I think. I think the people who were consulted and who were addressed by the media were mostly representing a very limited set of disciplines. And I think it's also difficult for scientists in general to appear in public if you don't have the connections already, because usually that's not how we work, right? So usually we are doing our research and we have the scientific community, and we are not doing advocacy, also not scientific advocacy on a normal basis, and we are also not consulting. But if we appear in the media, it's rather in such an explanatory role. But the impression was, and it was the right impression, at least in the first months, that very much of natural scientific knowledge was needed to understand what's going on. And it took some months to understand that this is actually a societal crisis. And then also the spectrum of experts heard on the media and consulted in the media broadened. But very, very many arguments were set in the first month. So I think there was a lot of priming by natural scientists that was then difficult to overcome. That's the first answer. The second, regarding social media, I think science, not just social science, but in general, has been really important as addressing the public directly, not mediated through the media. So social media and appearance of science on our own channels has been a very important instrument to overcome this gatekeeping function of classical media, and to be able to comment on certain developments and also to explain. Even virologists have a massive followership on the social media, and people also became really interested in certain developments. And so it has been important. It has also been important, the last sentence on that, for scientists to find other like-minded scientists from other disciplines that we weren't in contact with before. So I think some scientific advocacy coalitions were established through social media.
All right, thanks. And apologies that I skimmed through the questions in the chat right now, but I want to give our audience a chance to hear some of your thoughts on their questions. So let's just a bit of a back and forth right now, and my apologies. So there is a question on how to differentiate peace education from democracy learning, and I think global citizen learning, Uli, if I remember correctly. And maybe some of Norbert, or maybe Norbert, you want to say something on that? Just briefly, what in your view the differences are?
Very briefly. I think one common approach in both perspectives is that peace education and education for democracy can only be done not as an education for, but then as an education by democracy and by peace. Yeah. So I think this is a common ground. It's not only an issue; it's really to live democracy and to live peace. Yeah, that's one thing. In my understanding, peace education may go a little bit deeper in regard of what I mentioned already, some competences which really have to do with empathy, active listening, and some competences which may be not so relevant, maybe for democracy education. But that is my personal perspective. I know that there are a lot of persons and experts have other views on that. Very brief answer.
Yeah, thanks, Norbert. But just to mention that there is a very, very rich discussion in these days between different specific approaches of education. So global citizenship education, education on democracy and peace education, and now, of course, education for sustainable development and all these things. And this is really great and important. And it's a good thing to make now a connection with research. Just to mention one thing, there is one invitation in the chat to contribute to a planned Albert Einstein Discovery Center in Ulm, and I'm sure that we will come up with a few answers later. So thanks for this question too.
All right, thanks. I think we need to wrap up things before Anna has a chance to say a few words about the discussion. But the one thing I really want to know from our distinguished panelists is what do we need to do to bring our diverse parts of one field back together? So in terms of practices as academics, what should we do to bring us back together and maybe more relevant at the end? Wild suggestions and innovative ideas, much welcome. I don't know, maybe Elvira, do you want to maybe everyone just say one brief sentence, and we'll start in the round of, like at the beginning. Elvira, maybe first. Elvira?
One sentence, okay. A difficult question. I think interdisciplinary or intra-subdisciplinary work, as in our case, is more productive when it's problem-oriented than when it's research-oriented. So I would say working on concrete projects together with societal actors, for example, to find reconciliation mechanisms that we will need in this crisis.
Thanks. Berit, your one sentence.
My sense is, and I think it links back to the question of why there are only white people talking about peace education here. I think there's much more need to listen more and listen more to communities and listen more to people who already do stuff out there. It's not like nothing is happening in society. And I think to kind of work on that decolonization of knowledge is really, really important.
Thanks so much. Tony, you're next on my list.
I love it. Ask a really complex question and give us a chance to only answer it in one sentence. I love what Elvira and Berit have said. Maybe only I'll add to this these views, the importance of transdisciplinarity and again of understanding the interrelatedness of these different phenomena of violence that we're looking at requires a holistic and transformative approach. So that requires that we listen to each other in the various fields, which is a big problem in academia.
Thanks, Tony. And finally, Norbert.
Yeah, actually nothing new. I think there's really a need of a deeper understanding of other perspectives and the openness and a broader understanding, holistic understanding. It's the only way to handle this complexity in the world and this conflicts. Yeah.
All right. So I guess that's the wrap. And apologies for any questions in the Q&A that haven't been explicitly mentioned now in the discussion. We read them all, and maybe some of the panelists already responded directly. But it was much appreciated that you were so interested and raised all these questions. And now we have a brief conclusion by Anne.
Yes, thank you very much, and great discussion. And of course, it's impossible to summarize it. Just as a peace education practitioner, I wanted to ask the question, what next now? So we have said we want to cooperate more together, peace research and peace education. So one thing that I took from the discussion today is, although we have this huge complexity, we still have the task to be clear and to visualize our findings, because especially in times of crises, people are looking for orientation and for clear answers. And if we just go, well, it's complicated, then this answer will not be satisfactory for, let's say, students or the normal people. So it's not surprisingly that, for example, in the school books, we find Johann Galtung and Dieter Senghas, because they managed to put their findings into a clear model. And I'm asking myself, what would the current peace research models look like that we can print in school books? And I'd be happy to work together with colleagues on that. Second, yes, I think we can provide a lot of recommendations, solutions, ideas from our peace perspectives to issues such as the pandemic and climate change, etc. It has been mentioned that, for example, on reconciliation or trust building, there are findings that can be useful also for dealing with the social and political dimensions of the pandemic. So why not produce a podcast which involves questions such as, how do we build trust between enemies? How do we make peace with our planet? How do we find common ground about this pandemic? I think this would be a really great thing to do together. And third, that has been mentioned, a lot of times we have to broaden the group of knowledge producers. So citizens, students, normal people are not only knowledge receivers, but also producers. And we have seen like very creative tools of co-creation of knowledge. And I think we should think about how we can involve all groups of society in developing our knowledge together. And for example, in one of our projects, we work with students who then themselves produce explanatory videos on issues such as conspiracy theories. And this could be another approach where I'd be happy to work together with peace research in the future. So that being said, let me close today's event and say a big thank you to everyone who participated, discussed, prepared, and enriched this event. It was a great time I had, and thank you very much, and hope to see you again in one of our events or in another occasion. Goodbye.